um, it's actually it's somewhat backward how it's organized as far as talking about post-industrial economies and post-industrial cities, because we'll talk about those actually in later chapters more. But in these chapters, we talk about what came after post-industrialism. So in a nutshell, post-industrialism, well, industrial revolution, industrial economy, that's kind of what built central cities. The factory system, cities in that way of making things required a lot of people living close together so they could work in factories. When those jobs were either automated, which a lot of them were, right? We got robots making lots of things. That will only increase in the future. And a lot of those industrial jobs actually went to other countries in the world that would offer much lower cost, right? Many developing countries, they don't have environmental laws, they don't have worker protection laws, they don't have all these things that I think are actually really good for workers, but they raise the costs overall. Now that those places are developing, they're actually slowly getting their own kind of post-industrial economy. Also, as those places get more money, make more money, become more wealthy, they're also automating, right? So the same thing's happening to them, but kind of at a later stage. So the world often looks to the US, looks to Europe, looks to areas of East Asia, more developed places to see what they did, what did they do about these problems, right? And so when industrial jobs went away, we had lots of central cities that had lots of spaces for industrial uses that were not needed anymore, right? I would say in the Twin Cities, there's large areas that used to be manufacturing, especially along the river, that were converted into parks, converted into scenic walkways, converted into like condos and apartments, including affordable housing, right? Stuff that is more dense. Just an attempt to bring people back to the cities, because through time, suburban sprawl, many people left the central cities, especially after the industrial jobs went away. If you could afford to move out of the central cities, you did. And so some cities changed these areas into parks. Some have done mixed retail and you put in some, again, condos and things like that. But more and more they're finding that the amenities, the things, the reason that people move out to the suburbs, such as green spaces, if you just kind of put those a bit in central cities, they also become amenities and places where people want to hang out. And central cities are going through yet another problem, because after the pandemic, very often it's something like 50% of the office space that used to be downtown is no longer used, right? Because people are telecommuting, people are coming in only a couple days of the week, and so we again have a whole bunch of use in our central cities that we need to figure something else new about. And then many cities are pivoting to leaning toward doing this type of thing even more so, right? Changing even more of the central cities into green spaces, bringing back like creeks and streams that were often filled in. So what's the future of cities? As he said, new urbanism, mixed use development. What that means is, in the traditional urban sprawl setting, you would have a bedroom suburb, right? And you would have different zoning in different areas, because you wouldn't want heavy industry right next to where you're trying to sleep at night and raise a family and whatnot, right? So it made sense to have these zoning separate, but what that did was it made it so everything was separate. So in order to do anything, you had to drive, right? And so the car-centric culture, as this documentary pointed out, about half the population don't drive. They're either too young, too old, or too poor to have a car, right? And these people have to be able to still exist. We have public transportation, but it's really kind of mixed how useful they are, especially in car-centric countries like, America. I should move forward through this lecture instead of doing the whole thing on one slide. Other things cities are moving toward here and around the world, walkability. Many cities, as they became more and more congested, they just weren't built for places for people to kind of walk, to get on foot from here to there. So that's had to be kind of put in later. And you kind of will notice that in our cities, they're increasing bike paths, they're making more and more spaces where people can walk, where they're away from the traffic, so you don't have to be worried about some car bumping into you or something. And then alternative means of transportation. That's the light rail kind of being a new thing. Well, when I say a new thing, obviously we had a whole extensive trolley system in the cities for a long time, but those were all thoroughly gotten rid of, right? And the light rail is a bit of an attempt to bring that back. Anyone ride the light rail? Ride the light rail at all? A little? Maybe to a game or something? Not so much? A little? I would say honestly, the cities, they really let the light rail kind of deteriorate during the pandemic. I would say over 2020 and 2021, because so few people were riding them, you'd have a large percentage of the local homeless population just kind of being in them for the warmth and whatnot, and that really made it so that other people increasingly didn't feel safe on them. They didn't know what was going on, what they were going to encounter, and it's slowly switching back, but it's a process, and well, the cities were not, didn't really have the manpower for the police to kind of monitor these things before, and they're trying to increase that. But they're having trouble doing that as well. But as I say, mixed uses are also the other thing that are being really pushed for, because, well, a lot of these industrial things that we used to zone purposely away for, a lot of those don't exist as jobs anymore, and a lot of industry that does exist in more developed places isn't like toxic, isn't really noisy. It's things like 3D printing, right, which is like doesn't really affect local living standards, right? So allowing these uses to come back together, it would mean also that stores would be more walkable to where people are living if they're living in a place that's a bit denser. Smart growth policies, these are things that, well, basically similar to zoning laws where they would zone out industrial use, you zone out things you don't want. You could still zone out things that you don't want, and that could be things that are polluting, things that are sprawly, right? And so in our central cities, in our development, we have a lot of kind of control over the development of where people are moving to, and increasingly we're trying to have more mixed zoning, more people doing more things together, but also they're trying to increase density. So in the central cities, if there's a lot, like maybe it's an old industrial use lot that isn't used anymore, if that's changed into housing, it's like, well, let's require it to be dense. It's required to be big buildings so we could fit a lot of people in here. And then that also has the byproduct of you're just having more people in the city who could just utilize other things in the city and keep the economy going. A lot of central cities that were just commuter cities where people were going downtown to work, and then going home, it's like, well, they often didn't spend that much time or money in the cities themselves outside of lunch, right? Let's see, as I said, mixed use. Another thing that they're really trying to do is, as sprawl happens, right, and people are moving further and further out, and if there's not options to live in, people's commute time is expanding a lot, right? I don't know if any of you have had any large amounts of commute time to any work. I have when I have worked in one suburb, and then if you live in a suburb that's on the other side of the cities, right, and there's not a real good way to go directly through, so you kind of got to go around. And I've tried to take public transportation on that type of a thing, and it would be like 2 hours each way, which is a bit of a transportation nightmare. So by requiring more and more density in the central city, they're hoping to decrease these times in general. And again, this is the type of sprawl that a new urbanism is trying to counter. New urbanism being really a newish thing. Actually, it's always a bad idea when people want to use the word new to describe something that is because it won't be new forever, and we're still calling it new urbanism, even though it came about in the 90s, really got popularized in the 2000s, And so it's recent, but is it that new? So as I said, slow growth cities, again, what you do is you just have a boundary around your city and you require density within it. And if you're going to allow development outside of it, you try to restrict that. Often what you do is you'll have laws that will make it so that perhaps you have a preservation of cropland law where you're not allowed to take existing, maybe even wild areas, right? They're not allowed to switch that to development to keep some amount of green spaces. Our city doesn't do that very aggressively, I would say. Portland does that kind of thing. I've talked about all this stuff. Smart growth policies, right? Again, well, what does that mean? Again, in general, it's preservation in lots of different ways. Preservation of, like I said, cropland, wild areas, but also preservation of historic buildings. During the whole kind of urban renewal era in North America, lots of like really kind of beautiful older buildings were just tore down because they were just declared to be slums and blights. Lots of, there's actually a number of books locally called The Lost Twin Cities that are about these kind of architectural wonders that we used to have around that were just bulldozed over, sometimes to make room for highways, sometimes just to create an empty lot. It really depends, and the preservation movement is also a relatively recent thing, and as you could probably guess, well, the rest of the world has even more stuff to preserve, right? Because they've had their cities and their buildings even longer, so they have even more of a reason to kind of push for that. And that does create problems when you're trying to upgrade a city, but as you can see in this example, like most cities around the world, as they develop, they put in kind of pockets of newer buildings and pockets of newer stuff, especially as the world is going to be deindustrializing, similar to how we have. Example from the book of London having a green belt, right? London being, of course, like one of the most ancient cities in the world, but it's also a very modern city. It's a very developed place. And well, you have these areas that have been historical forests for, generation upon generation, right? And any of that you develop, that you bulldoze or whatever, that's like, at this point, it's old growth forest, right? That's these are the forests that are in fairy tales and stuff, right? It's like, well, do you really want to pave that over? Many cities are increasingly saying no. Urban design, a lot of these policies that we're talking about, they are urban design. They are the government deciding about how things should be and where they should be. There's lots of pros and cons of this, of course. Some would point out that, well, it's democratic at least. You could vote for politicians who pick these policies and whatnot. But then, of course, the argument is that a lot of people are disaffected if doesn't happen to be one of the two parties that they were voting for that are in office. Pros and cons of environmental design. Well, con being that is often not realized. What that means is you could have a big plan for mixed development and whatnot, but once it goes in, sometimes what happens is the businesses, right, when you have mixed use, that means a classic example would be you have a building, you have residential on top, you have little shops on the bottom, and you have, as I said, mixed use. Well, it doesn't guarantee those shops are going to stay in business, right? And you can see a lot of these where the shop just kind of is always has a new thing, and it will go for 6 months, and it won't kind of make it, and it will go out of business. And then the argument is it really mixed if the business part of it isn't there? It's like, well, but it depends sometimes. Sometimes it just takes a while for the business that will be successful in that space to kind of materialize. Also, well, a lot of the discussion about this is an attempt to also kind of diversify our cities, make it so the historical segregation that had existed. I don't remember how many people all saw that video that I showed about the local twin cities and that problem. But the hope would be creating affordable housing in the suburbs would allow people to move around more, and that we would have a diverse range of incomes and peoples in different places. How much that has happened? Well, it takes time. There has been an amount of that in certain suburbs and a certain amount of mixing for sure. Actually, I might bring some data on this Wednesday to go over some specifics. Other costs result in placelessness. Well, what that means is if you're designing every place to be mixed use in a very specific template, well, then they all just kind of look the same. And whereas often places want to really stand out. And when it says pros being crime reduction, a lot of new development and new design is specifically trying to get it so that basically there's a lot of eyes on the street. There tends to be less crime. If there's people on the street doing stuff, there's less crime because people will see it. And so, for example, well, you could have zoning laws that require that businesses that are on the ground level have lots of open windows, right? And you might think, well, what does that do? That actually really reduces how many times someone's going to try to rob that place. If there's giant windows and everyone can kind of see what's going on in that business, people don't want to rob it. It's too risky. Older cities really weren't made for this, right? The bottom levels did not have windows, often didn't even have places for a person to kind of comfortably exist. You kind of, if you're on the sidewalk, you needed to be basically on your way to where you're going, and that was it. But allowing for there to be more kind of people to hang out in the streets and stuff, again, like I said, reduces crime. As I said, I mentioned, we showed a good documentary on the history of redlining in a nutshell, if you weren't here for that video. In a nutshell, banks would draw a line around neighborhoods based on what they considered be the ability of the someone who buys a home, gets a mortgage, how much are they going to be able to pay that back? Well, old redlining often just determined this by race, which is a crazy thing, but they would, and they would draw a line around, and it wouldn't even be, it would be any place that was mixed at all, right? People know the musician Eminem, you all, too young, some of you? He had a song called 8 Mile. Anyone know what that was about? Heard the song though? You have your hand up?
Like growing up? Like in the trailer park?
Yeah. In Detroit, there's an area called 8 Mile, Wyoming. And it's an area of mixed race, right? Well, the banks told the white homeowners that they could not get mortgages for their houses, and that makes home ownership near impossible because you got to save up the whole amount to buy a house if you want to get a house. Well, what the white homeowners said in that area was, what if we build a giant wall separating the whites from the non-whites? Can you give us home loans then? And the banks actually said yes. So there exists a giant wall that we're separating the races in that area, which is one of the few kind of cultural landscape things that we see that still kind of represents these old practices. The wall is still there, although the whole area has become much more mixed through time. But that's kind of the craziness of redlining. Blockbusting, another term for this chapter. Blockbusting was, well, real estate agents would use this fear to try to make money on selling houses. So what you would do is would possibly go into a neighborhood, might hire some people of color to kind of like just walk around and look at a house that's for sale, and then you would have a real estate agent who would then go in and they'd say, oh, this area is changing up and the property values will go down, so you should sell now, sell to me at this low rate. And what they would do is they would then push up the price and then sell to a person of color at a much higher price, and they'd make a ton of money blockbusting. But this is also actually a way that these neighborhoods kind of changed over through time. It wasn't really until these laws were repealed, 60s and 70s, so it wasn't that long ago, that these practices changed up. This chapter shows some specific examples in Cleveland of where historical areas that had been redlined. And I know you look at this map in the book and you say it's pink, it faded. If I was them, I would have readjusted the colors so that it makes sense. But it's pink lined in this example. But how these areas, even though a lot of time has passed, the ethnic composition has still not changed up that much. In these examples, it really depends on the city that you're at and whatnot. Zones of abandonment and filtering. Well, like I was saying before, when everyone had a lot of sprawl, when everyone who was able to, if they had enough money to move out to the suburbs, they did, that left behind in the central cities the poorest of the poor, right? Populations who did not have enough money to get out. And schools and whatnot are run from local property taxes, so if you had only the poorest of the poor who were in these areas, all of a sudden the schools and everything else that are paid with your tax money started going down in quality. And that's not going to be a way for anyone to kind of move up, right? And so these are historical problems that a lot of cities have tried to address by kind of changing where tax money is spent and different things. But for a long period of time, decades, that made it so a lot of central cities emptied out of populations. And so you had lots of vacant areas. There's lots of cities that have not ever really come back from this, Detroit being a kind of the classic example. The Twin Cities had enough of a broad economy that although manufacturing declined and we did have manufacturing, it wasn't like everything that was happening. In Detroit, it was everything that was happening. Worldwide, well, the world is developing, the world is urbanizing at a very fast rate. But as you can see, there's plenty of places that have not urbanized, that have not, I would say, in the larger countries, if they had smaller maps. So for example, in China, this whole area is definitely urbanized, right? But as a country, the average, it's very rural as a country. India is similar, where if you go to some specific places, there's plenty of urbanization, but overall, it is still less urban than other areas, right? But urbanization is happening fast. If you remember when we were talking about our chapters on populations, of why in the rest of the world, well, it's less urban, but it's becoming urban. Those rural jobs, right? Every place is catching up when it comes to development. And we went through the rural, machines replacing a lot of people in rural jobs, pay going down in rural areas, people moving to the cities. That's what's happening in the rest of the world right now. All these populations moving to cities looking for work. Very often, depending on the city, the context can be very different. So many cities, people are moving in, and of course they don't own the land that they moved to. They're in a desperate situation. They usually don't have any resources that they have brought with them. And so they'll put together housing on whatever they can find, things that are discarded. That is what a lot of this early housing is like, right? And it's very, it's ripe for disease, it's ripe for crime, it's ripe for fires, for lots of problems, right? Squatter settlements, also known as shanty towns. Actually, let's skip that topic. So cities have lots of people who don't have money. The unemployment rate is very high because, again, you have so many people moving from rural areas to the cities. Jobs haven't come about. So you have lots of people who are in the informal economy. A reminder, the informal economy is, well, jobs that aren't regulated, you don't pay taxes, right? I kind of use the example of a garage sale. in the U.S. Because most of the jobs in the U.S. have become part of the formal economy. Much of the rest of the developing world, it's mostly the informal economy. That's part of the reason often their governments don't have a lot of money, is because you can't get people to pay taxes on something that they're not going to report that they're doing. There's been a lot of different methods that have been used to try to help out people in these shanty towns. A lot of the examples in Latin America, actually, the shanty towns, people, if they're allowed to eventually own that property, which happens sometimes, I would say in Latin American countries it's happened more than I've seen other places, but it's where the government will just kind of say, all right, you've put this much work into your house, we're gonna say that it's yours, we're gonna draw some property lines, and we're gonna start putting in like septic and sewer and things so that like it's not so poor as it used to be. And a lot of these can change over through time and become like middle class neighborhoods. But it really depends. There's plenty of places where that never happens. If you are never allowed to basically have ownership of that land, there's only so much you're gonna fix your place up, right? Because of eminent domain, right, which we have in this country as well as all other countries, but that's if the government ever at any point decides, actually we need this land for something that we're gonna do, we're just gonna demolish all this, right? That's something that the governments could always do if they haven't given the land over to the people who are living there. So again, they will often stay in disrepair and run down because you don't want to spend all your money on something that's going to be taken away from you. Environmental justice or injustice. This is a topic that actually comes up a lot in geography because very often people use maps to basically correlate poor populations with environmental burdens, right? It's especially true in these shanty towns, squatter settlements. The reason that it'll be land that no one was on, it could be like a garbage dump. It could be something that used to be a garbage dump. It could be an area, used to be an industry of some kind with who knows what pollutants in it, but no one pays attention, right? Those types of things happen not just in the developing world, but here as well. Like I said, it's a big subtopic area in the field of geography. China is one of the few places that has not had these shanty towns rise up, right? We talked about this a while ago about how, in China, they basically restrict where people can move. So although there is some movement to the coastal cities where there's more jobs, you got to get a permit to do it, basically. And there's other penalties for if you do this, right? But what this has meant is cities are often much more planned. This is just a little bit of Shanghai. Copyrights aren't really enforced in China, I've noticed. Shanghai is an example of a place that, they preserved their older buildings and they built plenty of new buildings. And also Shanghai has lots of pedestrian-only zones, trying to make a city as walkable as possible. Areas like this, pedestrian only, right? Sometimes you'll have a little vehicle that carries people around, but in general, right? You have, this is the Bund, which is the historical district, right? Which has all these old buildings from the colonial era that have been preserved. Whereas, like I said, lots of cities, they just bulldoze these down, and often just for industry or something like that. Right, some green space here and there. At night, lots of lights. This is a phenomenon I've only seen in tropical countries where, like, if you buy a soda, you get to go into a place that is air conditioned while you consume your cold beverage, and so they're selling the temporary air conditioning as well as the beverage. I don't know if people have traveled much to the tropics, but it's super humid. I was there for an urban planning convention, so that's why I have all these pictures of their development But again, China being a bit more authoritarian, they are able to have more strict laws about their planning and making sure that there is housing before you let the populations move into the cities, right? They've also have policies that elevate the salary of people in rural areas. It's a bit of an artificial elevation, but they do that so that less of the population are in desperate shape where they have to move to a city looking for work. So they plan ahead quite a bit. Just walking around Shanghai a little bit. Oh, and this is a little McDonald's trolley. Anyone could take it, but you had to be going to McDonald's. Oh, and this is a restaurant where if you paid extra for your table, they would put a tarp around, and so you would get air conditioning at your table, but other tables wouldn't. It's a bit of a unusual. This is Hong Kong, which is considered one of the densest cities in the world, but it's also one of the most expensive. It's very dense, and often in lots of places in North America, for example, people connect density with poverty. Plenty of places around the world where the density does not mean automatically it's going to be run down and whatnot, right? This is Macau, another old colonial city. Very good public transportation. Pedestrian-only district again. Like I said, most of the rest of the world, they prioritize pedestrian-only areas. Not parks as much as I would say North America is changing over to prioritizing parks in cities. Urban renewal, right? If you hear that term, the term itself sounds like, why would that be a contentious thing? It kind of depends. Urban renewal, in the 50s and 60s, the US was kind of like peak economically. As a reminder, after the Second World War, much of the rest of the developed world had been blown up. The US was one of the few countries that was relatively unscathed when it comes to its industrial capacity. So we were making stuff for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world needed our stuff. So we got a ton of money in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Put that money into the interstate highway system, right? These gigantic highways were mostly put in them. And when different cities were deciding where to put them through, you would have urban planners would declare areas slums, and then just demolish those areas. And then you would have eminent domain, right? Concept we were just talking about, where they would basically just take the land away from people. Sometimes they would offer an amount of money here and there, but that bulldozed a lot of communities in our central cities, kind of depending on where it went in and whatnot. There's some areas like the Rondo neighborhood, actually, which is just down the street on 94. They've proposed a project that's pretty interesting because, Rondo neighborhood, African American community that had a highway 94 put right through it. What they're gonna do is there are bridges that go over, and they're gonna reconnect, and so they're gonna put basically big covers over the highway and put in like parks and things. First project of its kind, and actually was approved last year. That's a project that will take like a decade to do, but a lot of places in the rest of the country have their eyes on it as a real interesting way to kind of take away the blight of the highways are on our central cities, right? Because the highways themselves, they're not like pleasant to hang out by, but if you just kind of cover them up, put in parks, yeah.
So they're gonna put like another big bridge and then put like as a park instead? What do you mean like a cover?
Yeah, okay, if you picture the highway, right, and then you picture there's a number of bridges that go over. If you pictured just like connecting all those bridges and putting in space so that the highway would then be a tunnel, but it would be like, you wouldn't put in a lot of things that were heavy, but you could put in an amount and some new housing and some stuff. That's what they're gonna do. I should bring in some specifics maybe next next class. Because again, like I said, it's a thing that was just approved earlier this year. This summer it was approved. And it's the first of the kind project. Be very interesting. Well, that's like I said, that's urban renewal. That's why urban renewal itself is more controversial than you might seem. Because when you look on paper, and it's like, oh, we're moving rundown buildings and crumbling neighborhoods and quote unquote slums. But these were actual communities that some of them still are vibrant, even though there's a highway put right through the middle of them. Well, efforts like that are also an attempt to revitalize central cities. This is an example. This is an area that used to just be industry, right? And they had these big tanks for fuel. When you had deindustrialization, you didn't have any use for those great big tanks. And it was like, well, what could you do? Well, change the riverfront area into more of an amenity that people can kind of stroll along and hang out. And then they changed over the big storage tanks into housing. And this is actually high income housing. So it also brought more incomes back to the cities, which is a thing that a lot of places are doing. And you could get a lot of people who argue that like cities are focusing too much on getting people with money to move back, but that's tax base that goes to the schools and goes to other things, goes to environmental cleanup. So it's like, well, you want to have mixed incomes in places. You don't want places to be all this income. And so it's kind of like, well, this is when the term gentrification kind of comes together. Gentrification is used a few times in this chapter. Gentrification basically, well, you have wealthy people move in here, right? So the overall tax rates, property taxes and stuff rise. If you have a local shop here and they're selling stuff, they may raise up the prices of their stuff because they have wealthier people here now. With these costs going up, maybe you have someone who's been living over here and maybe they've been living there generations and suddenly they can't afford this stuff in their own neighborhood, right? And so a lot of suburbanization of people from central cities have often been that. People who can't afford to live downtown because the stuff around them is too expensive now. Gentrification, kind of a classic quandary, right? Because we don't want people to all be segmented into certain areas and not others. We want mixture, but we want affordability, right? Oh, and environmental justice I already talked about. Challenges to sustainability. Well, there's lots of challenges. What are people doing? People are doing lots of things. This is another example in the book. You can tell it's Chicago, right, from the background, but this is more of an effort to not only try to make the old riverways that were just industrial sites, like clean up the pollutants, bring nature back. Doing these things makes it an amenity all of a sudden, right? Especially through time. I would say on our waterfront here, we've been doing this a good 20 years, and a lot of it has revived. And the quality of the water and the amount of fish have really increased. There have been times that, well, all the runoff in the river from the streets and everything, often kind of all that stuff washing into the river squeezes out the oxygen. So there are less and less fish, right? But there are a lot of people who like to go fishing in the cities. So if you kind of do this, you could kind of make it cleaner again, cleans up your air quality as well. This is an example of rooftop urban gardening, right? That's also an attempt to try to, create more green space in our cities, right? I would say Chicago is really big for making green roofs, the green roof movement. We've had some amount of that in the cities. I don't know if people have ever visited. I used to live in a building downtown that we had basically the roof of our building had a giant lawn with trees. I don't know if people have ever been to places that look like that. I would say the term for developing places that are abandoned, often polluted, is brownfield development as opposed to greenfield development. So a lot of sprawl is, of course, greenfield development because, well, it's a green field, right? And it's cheaper to develop that because brownfields, often they'll have a bunch of old buildings, right? It's like, well, you got to do something with that. How much does that cost, huh? And then like, okay, what if this was often places that have been industrial sites for like 100 years? It's like no one has track of even what was there. So that you need a whole environmental impact study. You need people to come in and check the soil quality. If it's all contaminated, doesn't mean you can't still development, but it costs a ton of money because you got to like dig all that dirt out and take it somewhere. Or you could have a processor. I don't know if you guys ever seen places going under development and they have a little facility where they're taking dirt and then they basically cook it and they cook off the pollutants and then they put the dirt back. Very expensive process. What the Twin Cities has done is it subsidizes that. It's like, oh, we did an environmental impact and it'll cost this much to clean it up, but we'll clean it up if you promise to develop something good over it, right? And that has been very successful, but we're a state that financially has always been doing pretty well, and so we have resources for that kind of thing, and a lot of other states and a lot of other cities just don't. And so those sites will just kind of sit abandoned. This is, of course, a successful example, and this is a real green roof, but this is like what many urban planners want the future to look like, right? You got just green everywhere. We'll see if that happens in our glorious future. Okay, study. One of the problems cities also have is urban heat island effect. Cities heat up, and mostly because, you have the sun coming in, and it hits pavement, which is often black, and that heats up more quickly. Some places they have codes about painting your buildings lighter colors to reflect more of the light, and more of the heat. Also, things that cool off places are just, water, right? When it rains, usually it's absorbed in the soil and plants, and then that's re-released into the atmosphere, and this is a process that cools an environment. Cities traditionally have been made with none of that, right? The water flows off immediately, goes down a gutter, and off to the river. So through time, cities have been heating up, and the effort to try to change this up, like I said, lots of places have been putting more and more parks in their urban places, or if you can, put a little park on top of buildings, if that's possible. These types of things will decrease the temperatures. A little bit about, greenhouse effect, which hopefully you've studied in other classes. This is going to be in regard to cities a bit more. The sun emits shortwave radiation, right? Shortwave, meaning the waves are shorter. When that radiation bounces off of anything, the earth or whatever else, it's long wave radiation. Long wave radiation just kind of stays in a place longer, and so places will heat up, especially if there's something making it so that those waves stay in place. So it's part of the reason why your car heats up. When you're in a summer day and you go off to do something, you come back to your car and it's all heated up. Got shortwave radiation, goes through those windows really easily, bounce out the car seat, and then it's long wave radiation, which actually does not leave as quickly. So heat builds up. All right, these types of landscapes cool off naturally, very rapidly, right? I'm not gonna go through all that. You also have the effect in lots of different places where this atmosphere over a city, it could be polluted, and it gets kind of stuck, right? Mexico City is kind of famous for this, also partially because it's in a kind of a big depression with mountains and whatnot on the sides. But other cities have this problem too, where like you have all this kind of polluted air and it just kind of can't get it to go away. If you've ever been driving out and you've seen any of this type of thing, this is actually an attempt to try to make the atmosphere kind of churn up more. They do this at some farms sometimes because they don't want the same air mass to be stuck over. So India, temperature map, in general, places that are further and further away from green spaces, that are further away from bodies of water, they'll tend to heat up. This is, I think this is Tucson, Arizona, right? And again, like I said, the sun's coming in, and the darker the surface, the more it heats up. So our roads are kind of among the darkest things that the light will hit, right? But often a lot of buildings, when they put in their rooftops, it's often just automatic to paint it black. And it's like, well, then it's just gonna be, you're gonna have a melting ceiling. These are mountains, which are difficult to build on, so there's in general less buildings and more greenery, right? And so even in Arizona, you have places that are quite a bit cooler. Oh, there are my cards. All right, I got a couple of questions for y'all.